Hello students, Professor Watts here, and today we're going to talk about corporate governance issues in international finance. So we'll start off by just kind of recapping the idea of the public corporation, in other words, a publicly held corporation which raises its capital primarily by issuing shares of stock to shareholders. So we want to talk about why that is such an important business form in the modern economy. So let's look at the pros. Well, you can acquire a significant amount of capital and make big productive investments, and then you can spread that risk over many small investors. So even if the company fails, small investors, probably don't lose their whole savings because they've ideally also spread out their investments across many corporations and many different kinds of assets through the principle of diversification. And you can also just raise more capital this way than you could by limiting sources of capital to just a few investors or a few banks or something like that. So these can be huge corporations, and then they can really create a lot of capital and be productive and profitable, and this leads to economic growth, undoubtedly. But that which has benefits also has costs. So what is the downside, or what's the negatives about a public corporation? Well, because you have separation of ownership and control, and specifically the ownership, the stockholders, is really distant from the control, the management of the company. It's really kind of unattached. It's really distant. It's really attenuated. So we get what's called an agency problem. Managers are tempted to use funds for self-serving ends rather than investing them in the business's projects to generate profits for the benefit of shareholders. Adam Smith had a handle on this back in the 1700s. Joint stock companies or publicly held companies had already been around for 150 years or so, and it was noticeable that there were some incentive problems. Let's take a look at what Smith had to say in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. So he says, the directors of such joint stock companies, however, being the managers rather of other people's money than of their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners of a private copartnery frequently watch over their own. Negligence and profusion, therefore, must always prevail more or less in the management of the affairs of such a company. So Adam Smith focused on this idea that the business is using other people's money. If you took Econ 201 with me, you'll hopefully remember that we spent quite a bit of time talking about problems that arise. I focus on problems that arise in government, but these problems can arise in businesses as well. If you're dealing with other people's money, you're not going to be as efficient with it as people spending their own money. So that's the agency problem. Let me give you a little bit more on this concept, and then we'll start talking about what kind of structures and mechanisms corporations try. There's a long list of them, and they can use several of them all at once to overcome this. So the agency problem is kind of properly defined in these terms. You, the principal, hire someone, the agent, to do a job for you. The agent tends to do what's in his or her self-interest, not necessarily what's in your self-interest. Now sometimes those things align, but many times they don't. So to solve the problem, we have to come up with a way to align the incentives of the principal and the agent. Posted a video alongside this one that is a quick overview of principal-agent problems. They often arise because of information asymmetry. The principal doesn't have the same information at his disposal as the agent does, and therefore the agent can engage in what's called opportunistic behavior. You could think of it in negative terms as ways of ripping you off, or just ways of doing a job in a lackadaisical fashion that makes the work easier, or billing you more hours, charging you more for things that aren't needed. Just ways for the agent to line his own pockets at your expense because you're not on top of the situation. And so this is common in many situations in life, and in corporate governance it's kind of the critical issue that we need to figure out. Okay, so how do we go about solving the agency problem? Well, there's a long list of mechanisms that corporations will adopt to various degrees. So you can have a board of directors that's kind of independent from the management of the company to be there as representatives of the shareholders, and then they can oversee the management somewhat directly to make sure they do their jobs properly. You can have large shareholders who have such a significant stake in the business that they are going to be more interested in taking an active role in monitoring the managers, the executives of the business, to make sure they don't waste money or just kind of feather their own nest at the expense of the corporation's profits and therefore benefits to shareholders in the form of higher dividends or higher stock values. You could have managerial incentives. The most common one here, of course, would be making managers also shareholders by paying them in stock. Now, that's a very common mechanism. It's pretty widespread in the United States, especially for the past several decades. Problem that kicks back from that is that if management people, executives, become the largest shareholders in a company, they do have incentives to make the share price go up. So that seems to be in the shareholders' best interest. But they also might take steps that are fraudulent or kind of shady in order to boost the share price at least in the short term. And it could be to the long-term detriment of the company, because if their share prices go up, they can sell them now, pocket the cash, and then they won't necessarily care if they burn the company down, so to speak, by cooking the books, engaging in accounting fraud, or that kind of thing. There's this issue of debt versus equity financing. A corporation that relies more on debt financing, it has to make the interest payments to the bondholders, whereas a corporation that engages in equity finance doesn't have to make dividend payments to the stockholders. So the use of debt is often seen as kind of a control mechanism. It kind of forces the executives of the company to share, so to speak, the profits and the cash flow of the company with the investors in a way that equity financing doesn't. So there's that could be used in addition. And then there's kind of some outside mechanisms. So the market for corporate control, as it's called, or takeovers. If management is not running a company efficiently, if they're kind of squandering money on their own pet projects or padding themselves with too many perks, otherwise just not running a company well, there is a prospect of outsiders raising capital and then making a takeover bid. So basically they'll come to the significant shareholders of the company and say, hey, we want to buy this company, replace the management. Usually involves significant downsizing of kind of extraneous divisions of a company, getting rid of a lot of unneeded workers, streamlining the corporation, making it run more efficiently. So the market for corporate control is pretty important, kind of an outside check on managerial excess. This is pretty controversial. It's been the subject matter of several movies, if you recall the original Wall Street film from the 1980s. But it arguably plays a pretty important role in keeping companies more efficient and profitable than they otherwise would be, because without the threat of a corporate takeover, management has less incentives to keep expenses in check and run a company efficiently and profitably. Okay, then there's laws and regulations that are promulgated outside of the corporation. Most of these are aimed at either the issue of shareholder rights, improving shareholder rights through the legal system, or improving the transparency of the company's accounting and financial reporting, and that's done through a corporate regulatory environment. Okay, now we want to take a look at this issue of law and corporate governance and see how different countries have different legal systems and regulatory structures, and how that generates different outcomes with regard to both the performance of firms and then the kind of the scope of public corporations within different economies, and how well they do and how much they contribute to a country's economic growth. So we want to go actually pretty far back in time to the legal origins of different countries to understand the differences that we see across countries today. So we'll talk about that for a few minutes, and then we want to look at the outcomes, how those legal origins lead to different outcomes with regard to firm and economic performance. And then we'll wrap up by looking at some reform proposals or recent reform measures that aim at improving a country's legal and regulatory environment in order to improve the performance of corporations towards contributing to their economies. Right, so we want to start with legal origins. Commercial legal systems, so corporate law, really derive from one of few legal origins. We've got English common law, French civil law, German civil law, and Scandinavian civil law. So you'll notice that even within these categories, there's really only two big ones. There's common law system, and then civil law systems. And the biggest players here are going to be English common law. There's really no other common law tradition. And then of the civil law traditions, the most relevant one for the world today is the French. So we will kind of compare the French and English basic legal structures side by side and think about how those impact the corporate environment today. So if you're wondering which countries kind of utilize, at least kind of as a basic bedrock fundamental basis for their legal system, this is a pretty comprehensive map that tracks the categories the book talks about. So the English, German, French, Scandinavian. And as you can see, the yellow countries, English common law, that's going to be England, and then all the colonies of England, and then a lot of places that England had kind of a disproportionate influence on, mostly through colonization. Some countries kind of adopted the English system because they knew it worked well. And by the way, this part of the world is sometimes, at least most of this, is sometimes referred to as the Anglosphere. Okay? The Anglosphere being kind of the part of the world that has a English kind of outlook, especially with respect to governance, institutions, and especially with respect to the legal system. So the common law legal system foundation, and kind of an emphasis on individual rights, economic freedom. I want to mention this has nothing to do with being English. It has nothing to do with ethnicity or race, because England brought these ideas to a diverse part of the world. So there's parts of Africa and Asia that are in the Anglosphere, even though they weren't really necessarily heavily colonized or settled by the English, because they brought their legal system and kind of their way of doing things economically. So the Anglosphere is kind of one pole of the world with respect to legal foundations, legal origins, and corporate governance. And then the French, as I mentioned, the other big one, because the French system kind of went through most of the rest of Europe via Napoleon. So Italy, Spain, and then the offshoots of their colonies in the New World. And then you can see the other legal traditions are kind of insignificant in comparison. Although the German realm is pretty large, it's more in common with the French civil law system than the English common law system. So if you want to make a rough grouping, again, you can kind of group all the civil law systems together. So it's really civil law versus common law in the grand scheme of things, and that's how we'll make the comparisons here going forward. Okay, so how are these different and why does it matter? Well, for us right now, the focus is going to be on this issue of investor rights. Which system does a better job of protecting and recognizing the rights of investors, and therefore making it more attractive to be an investor in a public company? If the legal system does a better job recognizing and protecting investor rights, more people are willing to buy stocks, and then stock markets can flourish, and then you can have a greater scope for public companies with all their benefits in your economy. But then, of course, you're also going to have the mechanisms to deal with the principal agent problems that are always there with publicly held companies. So let's kind of just give a high-level overview of the differences between common law and civil law, and then we'll make an application of this to stockholder rights. Right, so in common law, it's kind of a decentralized system. You have more local control and decision-making regarding disputes. Juries are much more important in common law, especially with respect to civil suits. So if one party is suing another party, it's more likely that a jury will have gotten involved to help settle the dispute. It's kind of decentralized, dispersed decision-making and dispute resolution rather than centralized top-down adjudication, which is more common in the civil law tradition. Judges have discretion and can adjust rules, maybe the most important feature of common law, which makes it adaptable to changing situations, because judges, while they are bound to precedent to some extent, they also have the flexibility to realize that, if a certain case brings up questions that haven't really been settled before, they can make a decision and make a rule on the spot, and then you get kind of some gradual changes and adaptation of the law over time to meet new situations, new technologies, for example. So old rules might not be clearly applicable to new technologies, so judges have the freedom to kind of tweak and modify those rules. We're not talking about wholesale changes, right? We're not talking about judges making up new rules on the spot. We're talking about judges making adjustments and adapting things. So it's kind of a flexible system, not too rigid, and it's adaptable to a changing business environment. Civil law, on the other hand, vests the authority at the top level, centralized level, national government. You don't have juries in civil cases necessary in a civil law system. You don't necessarily have even the same kind of legal procedure in terms of what kind of rights the accused has and the ability to mount your own defense and those kind of things. What you do have are specific, what are called bright line rules. They're very formally articulated rules that are supposed to apply to every single case. And then that just leaves judges with the role of deciding whether a party has violated one of those rules or not, rather than kind of interpreting the rules or adapting them and applying them to unique situations. So there's less room for discretion for the judges. It's more of a black and white situation rather than some with gray and nuance. The rigid rules of the civil law system have to be changed top down rather than being adaptable through judges with their discretion over particular cases. So those differences work themselves down really over the centuries and over case law, and they do have a very noticeable impact on the outcomes you observe, especially with respect to the entire economy, really. And there's a lot of different things we could talk about here with respect to the impact of the legal system, but we are focusing on the performance of publicly held corporations and investor rights. So let's focus on the outcomes that these different legal structures give in that realm. So for publicly held companies and the common law nations, generally speaking, you have much less concentrated ownership of publicly held companies. So in other words, it's the public that owns them rather than like a small group of people that would be more common in the civil law regimes. You have concentrated ownership by the members of the family that started the business, maybe members of its key banks or syndicates of other firms within the same industry. Joint stock companies are going to be more common in the common law countries, more prevalent, and therefore they're going to generate more investment in economic growth and lead to superior economic performance because, as we said earlier, they can marshal more capital and undertake bigger, more profitable projects than smaller companies are able to. Some other problems that you'll see in the civil law system is that you have a lot of obtuse control systems that are geared towards creating benefits for insiders. So a lot of times that's going to be these people here who have the concentrated ownership of the shares. Okay, that's the insiders we're talking about. They create systems and patterns of stock ownership and corporate ownership and control that benefits them at the expense of outsiders. And the book goes through these in detail. I'll just mention them here. They have the issuance of different kind of shares that have different voting rights. So some people can own shares that have more votes than other people's shares. You have structured ownership where one firm owns another firm, so a small number of stockholders can control multiple companies through that system. You can have, I call them syndicate cross-holdings, where businesses within an industry own shares of other businesses within the same industry, so there's kind of interlocking patterns of stock ownership, and that gives a smaller group of people more control of those companies through owning the shares. And then possibly most important for the differences we're going to be looking at is that you have weaker shareholder rights, and that limits the role of joint stock corporations, and that actually makes joint stock corporations less common, less influential in these economies, and therefore it actually reduces their economic growth, their economic performance a little bit relative to the places where the legal environment is a little more conducive to the flourishing of publicly held companies. All right, so let's look at some evidence on this straight out of the textbook. First off, just compare Italy and the UK. Italy is a classic example, a kind of a typical example of the French civil law regime, whereas the UK, of course, would be English common law. Shareholder rights index is as low as it can be in Italy. Shareholders have minimal legal respect, whereas they're as high as they can be in England. Okay, so what can shareholders do? They can sue, they can exert more influence through their votes, voting their shares. You have much higher concentration. The three largest shareholders own an average of 58% in the Italian corporations versus only 19% in the English corporations. So the ownership of these companies over here is much more diffuse amongst the public. Stock market capped relative to GDP. This says the value of the companies is only 38% of GDP in Italy, where it's over 200% of GDP in England. So that means there's a lot more stock market capital. There's a lot more capital that's been marshaled and put to work by public corporations here. Number of listed stocks, much higher in England as well. Okay, another thing we can look at, and this is from the book, it's a table of this kind of some of the same data we were looking at with England and the UK. So we have common law countries first, and then we'll look at civil law countries. Ownership concentration, so what percent of the companies owned by the three largest shareholders, market cap to GDP, so what percent of the total output of a country is represented in the capitalization of public companies, and then how many domestic firms are there per population. Just note the comparisons of the average here. In the common law countries, the average concentration of ownership for the top 3 owners is 43%. The rate of market cap to GDP is 60%, and there's 35 companies per population. Whereas with the civil law countries, you got higher concentration at 54%, you've got much lower market cap at 21%, and you have a much smaller number of companies at only 10 per population. Another thing we'll look at here is shareholder rights index and rule of law index. So for English common law countries, you got a pretty high score on shareholder rights, 4 out of 5. And you have a pretty good score on rule of law, 6 out of 10, although some of the countries over here, especially some of the African and Asian countries, don't do very well on rule of law. You can see the U.S. there does very well on both of these, has a 5 on shareholder rights and a 10 out of 10 on rule of law. So we've got 4 and 6.4 in the English common law countries versus 2.3 and 6.05. So rule of law is just a little bit weaker on average in those French countries, but shareholder rights are significantly weaker. So that's going to be the main difference between civil law and common law regimes. Okay, so let's close by talking about legal reform. Countries want to improve their legal environment so they can take maximum advantage of public corporations. The goal of legal reform in this regard would be to strengthen the protection of outside investors from expropriation by managers and controlling insiders, or in other words, to reduce the principal agent problem so that principals, stockholders, don't get taken advantage of by their agents, the managers and executives of the company. Reform requires then the following 3 objectives. Strengthen the independence of boards of directors with more outsiders. Boards of directors was listed first in the mechanisms to overcome agency problems because it is the most important one, it's the most prominent one. You won't find a corporation that doesn't have a board of directors. The issue is going to be who dominates the board of directors. Are they corporate insiders who are just basically there to rubber stamp whatever the current management wants to do, or are they actual concerned outsiders representing the bulk of the shareholders? Second, you want to enhance the transparency and disclosure standard of financial statements. This way, investors can know how firms are doing. They can have objective results and do objective analysis and then make investment decisions accordingly. And then finally, according to the book, you want to energize the regulatory and monitoring functions of your securities regulators. That would be the Securities and Exchange Commission here in the U.S. and your stock exchanges. How realistic is reform? Well, it's very difficult because it has to go through a political process, which involves both possibly making alterations to a fundamental legal structure, which tend to be pretty entrenched. You have a lot of people with vested interests in the current system, especially those corporate insiders who are the beneficiaries when it comes to principal agent problems, and they might resist any attempt to change the status quo. You see this both at the corporate level and at the kind of nationwide level. So insiders who can feather their own nests and give themselves perks by kind of siphoning off a corporation's profits, they will resist changes in the corporate governance structure, whether it's an independent board of directors or incentives that align management's interests with shareholders, etc. They might also, at the political level for the whole country, resist reforms that are meant to give shareholders more protection, with independent boards of directors or better accounting rules and transparency and things like that. So if you're into reform, you need to understand those political dynamics and the fact that a lot of people might not be happy with reform and might try to block it. We'll look at a couple of key reforms that have had a major impact in recent years. In the U.S., we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This was in 2002. This is kind of on the heels of the dot-com stock bubble, and there were some corporate accounting scandals and corporate frauds that also occurred roughly that time period, most notably the Enron scandal, which unfolded around 2001. And Sarbanes-Oxley was Congress's response to that. The goal was to improve corporate financial reporting. And it's a complex law, but there's 4 major components. So there's accounting regulation changes, There's the imposition of independent audit committees on publicly held corporations. There's refinements of internal control, accounting controls. And then there's the imposition of executive responsibility. Executives now have to sign off on a firm's quarterly and annual statements. If there's material misrepresentations in there, executives could be liable for them. They could actually lose a lot of money and be legally responsible as well. So it's basically the government really tightening down public corporations' accounting standards and financial reporting requirements. So, did this improve corporate governance in the United States? Well, arguably, yes. Arguably, the quality of financial reporting is much better. But that which has benefits also has costs. Nothing is free, and there are some downsides. There's some costs to this kind of reform. Costs of compliance went up, especially Section 404, which is this assessment of internal control. And companies now have to repeatedly generate reports and assessments, evaluate basically their own internal control mechanisms. So very difficult. They have to bring in a lot of people, employees, consultants, and lots of extra paperwork and filing. And that is a cost that diverts resources from the company running its business. So if you're a Ford Motor Company, you could spend more money on engineers trying to come up with better technologies for your cars, safety, fuel efficiency, lower emissions, whatever. Or you could spend those resources complying with the new government accounting regulations. Arguably much easier for large established companies to undertake this compliance than for small startup companies that are always going to be short on cash and capital in comparison with the large established companies. So there's a theory called the capture theory of regulation, which says that oftentimes large companies welcome new regulation because they know even though it's going to raise their compliance costs and it's going to create an additional burden, it's going to disproportionately raise the compliance costs and the burden for smaller competitors, and that's going to help kind of cement the position of the large established companies. A lot of foreign firms that listed their stock in the U.S. to take advantage of the superior legal environment actually decided that it wasn't worth it anymore because now they also have to comply with the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. So you can measure the impact on the regulatory burden, and it's hotly debated whether these reforms were net benefits. I'll just leave it with that. Okay, now let's go to England. In England, I'm not nearly as familiar with this, so I found this pretty interesting to learn about the Cadbury Committee. And they came up with something called the Code of Best Practice. So England had its own spate of corporate scandals. This was back in the 1980s with corporations kind of cooking the books and misleading shareholders. So they formed a committee led by the CEO of Cadbury. That's the candy company. And they came up with a report, amongst which was the Code of Best Practice. That was a corporate reform aimed mainly at improving shareholder rights and shareholder representation through restructuring boards of directors. So they said board of directors of public companies in the UK had to have more outsiders, more outside directors, and you couldn't be the CEO and the chairman of the board of directors at the same time. Creates a conflict of interest. Okay, here's the Cadbury Code itself. It says the board's got to meet. They've got to actually be effective in controlling the company. They've got to spread decision making amongst members of the board, and they've got to be independent. All right, so let's wrap up our whole discussion here. Public corporations have huge advantages, as we've stated. They can corral more capital, undertake larger investments, generate more profits, and if there's a vibrant public corporation component in the economy, that's going to generate more economic growth over time. But we have to cope with the agency problem. How do we get corporations to serve shareholders rather than insiders? In other words, how do we get the management team of a business to really act in the best interests of the owners of that business rather than just their own short-term self-interest? So there are many well-established practices to control agency problems. Boards of directors, incentive pay, stock options, using more debt relative to equity financing, having better accounting and financial reporting practices, and so on. Just want you to be familiar with them. This is not a class on corporate management practices, so we're not going to go into more depth on these, but as a business student in general, you should be aware of these. And in the context of international business, which is what we care about, the main thing is we want to know, at least at a broad level, how the legal structures of different countries vary and how that generates different outcomes for corporate governance and control. The big point there to remember is that common law systems have excelled civil law systems in protecting shareholder rights, and therefore you're going to find many more public corporations per capita in your common law countries, and they're generally going to do a better job and play a more prominent role in their economies.